this evening. But before I introduce my colleague Jake Chant, who works for the River Otter Beaver Trial, to talk about, of course, our topic tonight, which is the River Otter Beaver Trial and its outstanding success over the last 5 years. There are just a couple of housekeeping messages that I need to give you. Everybody should be muted. That means that you should only be able to hear myself and the speaker, Jake. And then, as I said just a couple of minutes ago, if people could turn off their video, if there's anybody still with their video camera on, if you could turn that off, that helps with the bandwidth and should mean that you can see the presentation in all its glory. And Jake has a number of very nice beaver videos which he plans to show, which will work better if you don't have your video camera on. The other thing to say is if you could select speaker view, which is in the top right corner of your screen, there should be an icon that says view there. If you click on speaker view, that will mean that you can see Jake's presentation rather than it being a small icon in the corner of your screen. And the other thing to say is that this session is going to be recorded. So if you want to share the recording with other people, then by all means do so. It will be on our YouTube channel probably from this evening. But be aware that this session is being recorded. And then finally, to ask a question tonight, the only way that you can do that is through the chat function that Zoom provides. So that's at the bottom of your screen. You should be able to click on that and you can type in your question. Jake will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we should have 15-20 minutes or so for questions, which I'll ask for him through the chat function that you've provided, the questions via. So anyway, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce my colleague then, Jake Chant. Jake has worked for the River Otter Beaver Trial for 3 years, the past 3 years, and tonight he's going to talk about the experience of working on that trial and also the science and evidence that that trial has yielded. So over to you, Jake.
Right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for the introduction, Steve. Absolute pleasure to give you a talk tonight on the River Otter Beaver Trial. Tonight's talk is going to go through the science and evidence report that was published in March this year. Before that, I'll also make sure that you're aware of some beaver basics. We'll talk about a bit of beaver ecology and a bit about beaver behaviour. If you have questions, please let Steve know, and there'll be time at the end for me to answer them as best I can. So, I think a good place to start is the fact that we had some really good news in August. The government have allowed the River Otter beavers to stay on the River Otter, and Devon Wildlife Trust have been absolutely chuffed with this news. We're really excited to see the government allowing a really important species back into our countryside. Just to introduce a bit about beavers. Beavers are a native species. There are 2 species of beavers in the world today. We have the North American beaver and we have the Eurasian beaver. The Eurasian beaver was hunted to near extinction across Europe for people's desire for felt hats, which were very fashionable between 1550 and 1850. But beavers are a keystone species. They have a huge impact on the surrounding landscape and a really big impact on biodiversity. And that's one of the reasons why ecologists and conservationists are so excited about this government news. So here we can see, this is one of the beavers we have in the River Otter catchment. And this was filmed in the summer months. And you can see that this beaver, who's a female, is out early in the evening feeding on aquatic vegetation. And they are herbivores. They do not eat fish. A really important message to get across. They are nocturnal for most of the time. And here we can see more footage from, actually this is from the River Tail. And we've got a beaver out on land. They don't often come out on land. They much prefer being in the water. And this footage gives us an idea how beavers have evolved for their way of life They've got a really big gut, and that's to digest cellulose, the bark they eat, big webbed hind feet, and that large tail at the end. That tail contains lots of blood vessels and helps to regulate the beaver's body temperature. Beavers have approximately 3 kits per year, 1 litter per year, and there's been good survivorship of those kits to date. This is a document that I'm going to base quite a bit of my talk on today. It's the River Otter Beaver Trial Science and Evidence Report, and the lead author of this report was Professor Richard Brazier. You can find this report as a PDF on Devon Wildlife Trust's webpage, as well as web pages of Exeter University. The River Otter catchment is in East Devon. It's a relatively small catchment. The mouth of the river is at Budleigh Salterton, and from there the river runs upstream towards Ossory St Mary, and at Ossory St Mary the river heads northeast up onto the Blackdown Hills, and the source of the River Otter is actually in Somerset. Beavers have been on the River Otter since 2008. Early signs were spotted by wildlife enthusiasts, and that's when beaver numbers would have been very low. The government got interested in beavers on the River Otter in 2014, when footage emerged of a beaver family with beaver kits. And the government weren't particularly happy with this situation because adult beavers from Europe can potentially carry a type of tapeworm that we don't have in the UK. And actually, Natural England and DEFRA wanted to remove the beavers from the River Otter catchment. With support of lots of our members and local communities, Devon Wildlife Trust managed to persuade Natural England to run a 5-year trial. And in 2015, that trial started. At the very beginning, Animal and Plant Health Agency came down to trap our beavers to make sure that they were Eurasian beavers. We didn't want North American beavers on the River Otter. And they had to ascertain how many beavers we had in our catchment. So they found 2 adult pairs and 5 younger kits living on the river. At the very beginning of the trial, the beavers were given a very thorough health check. We were particularly interested in finding this tapeworm that beavers can carry in Europe, and we were particularly interested in looking for other diseases that wildlife can carry. The beavers were given ultrasound scans, blood tests, they had fecal samples taken, and the beavers even had a lung wash to look for bovine tuberculosis. The beavers were given the all clear after their MOT, and they were re-released onto the river in 2015. When we release any beavers onto the River Otter, they have to have a couple of things, and that's because the license that we have from Natural England states we have to do certain things. So the beavers have coloured ear tags in both ears, and they have a bit tag, which your pet cat or dog might have in the base of its neck. This is so we can identify beavers. If they were to leave the River Otter catchment, we'd be able to say that yes, they are the River Otter beavers. And during the trial, we had to bring back any beavers that left the catchment. So, as I've said at the start of the trial, we had 2 families, and you can see that they're active in the stretch south of Ossory St Mary, down towards Budleigh Salterton. And winter monitoring of beaver activity that takes place every year, we call it a systematic survey, and it's when we walk across the catchment looking for beaver feeding signs, beaver lodges, and beaver dams. And that gives us a really good idea where hotspots of beaver activity are. And throughout the years, we can see that these hotspots of activity are gradually spreading out around the catchment. Some of these populations or new family groups have been released by Devon Wildlife Trust. We had a license to release an additional 5 individual beavers, and that was to increase the genetic diversity of the beaver population. And you can see that by the end of the trial, we've got beavers throughout the catchment, all the way at the top of the River Otter and up on a number of the tributaries. And this is because the beavers are having kits. And this is the first of a few videos, so I hope your connections are okay. But beavers typically have 1 litter per year, and they average around 3 kits, although some females do give birth to more than that. We've had one large female near Otterton give birth to 5 one year. She only has 4 nipples, and actually one of those beaver kits was a runt, but even that small beaver managed to survive. As the number of beavers increases in the River Otter, our winter trapping work has shown that the conflict between beavers is beginning to develop. On the photo on the left-hand side here, we can see there's quite a large scar in the tail of this beaver, and that's because another beaver has bitten its tail. They're fiercely territorial, and they do defend their territories very clearly, and we can see how well defined their territories are when we complete the systematic survey. One of the pieces of work that X-University have completed, and throughout this talk I'll be referring back to work completed by X-University, one of their pieces of work is to model how many territories the River Otter catchment could carry. In ecological terms, that's called a carrying capacity. Hugh Graham, the PhD student that did this work, has found that the River Otter could hold between 147 and 179 family groups. Now, that's an awful lot of beavers. At the moment, we have 15 beaver families, and it's highly likely that whoever ends up managing beaver populations, and it could well be Devon Wildlife Trust, is likely to step in to manage beavers before we get to that number. And that's because this landscape is absolutely dominated by us and the way that we manage landscapes, whether it's for agriculture or for living in. Beaver behaviour is very different throughout the catchment. So territories at the bottom of the river, where the river's wide and deep, the beavers behave in a very different way than they would do at the top of the catchment when they're in smaller streams. At the bottom of the river, we see, if you're right next to a beaver lodge, you'll see some feeding signs. You might notice a beaver lodge if you know what to note or what to look for, but many people walking up and down the public footpaths don't actually realise they're standing right next to a hub of beaver feeding signs or beaver lodge. In smaller streams, there's no escaping the fact that you've got beavers. This is a video of one of the dams we've got in one of the tributaries in the River Otter, and the beavers are building a dam to create deep water. The beavers feel safe in deep water. They've evolved with predators like wolves, brown bears and lynx and humans, and deep water provides them with refuge. It also provides them with a route to travel through their own territory back home to the safety of their lodge. The increase in water height also enables the beavers to swim to access their food, whether that's soft vegetation growing in the sun months or whether that's bark off typically willow trees in the winter. As well as building dams, beavers also excavate canals throughout their territories. And they typically do this again where they've got a dam that's pushing water from a small stream out onto a floodplain. And the beavers are very good diggers, and they excavate a network of channels throughout some of the floodplains, and they control water heights with a number of dams, and then they use these canals to float material downstream. And this is a video of that happening. We can see the dredged material up on the left-hand bank that the beavers have excavated, and they've used their front paws to swim underwater and push that mud up on top of the bank. And this beaver is doing what humans have done with canals over a few years. It's transporting heavy goods from one location to the next. That particular beaver is taking that stick back to its lodge, where it will break that stick into smaller pieces, feed on the bark, and then probably end up piling those sort of stripped sticks on top of its lodge. Ecologists and conservationists call beavers a keystone species, and that's because they have a big impact on a wide range of biodiversity. They're effectively creators of ecosystems, and in the beaver's case, they're creators of wetland ecosystems. At one of our sites, we've noticed an increase in water vole populations, as the beaver activity has increased. So the beavers at a particular site, which is a county wildlife site, have created many dams and new ponds within a wetland area, and they've dug out a network of canals. And then the water voles have moved in to those canals. And what we're looking at in this slide is some water vole droppings. Water voles themselves are a rare mammal, so it's really exciting to see this kind of change taking place, specifically because of the return of the keystone species, the beaver. And I'm not going to be rude about this piece of work. This is a fantastic piece of work, but it's a bit like sort of a junior school experiment. You can imagine kids going out and doing this kind of counting. But what we've done in the West Devon beaver enclosure, a site where we've had beavers in a fenced area since 2011, is we've completed frog spawn counts. And this gives us a really nice idea of how beavers not just increase the biodiversity of a site, but also increase the sheer biomass of wildlife at any one location. So in 2011, we had 10 clumps of frog spawn, that was pre-beaver. And then a few years later, we've got over 680 clumps of frog spawn, which is an absolutely massive impact, really beneficial. And obviously, if they're increasing that sort of the bottom of the food chain, so tadpoles and small froglets, that kind of thing, that's going to have a really big impact on species like grass snakes and other wildlife that feed on that, the food at the bottom of the food chain. So beavers are interacting with all sorts of different wildlife. They've obviously been extinct in England anyway for quite a long time. We think roughly around 400 years. So beavers are beginning to meet other animals. We have a family of otters living very close to some beavers at one particular location. And that's tolerated for most of the year. But as you can see in that video, that's an adult beaver politely asking an otter to disappear from its territory. And that's because that particular video was taken in the summer when the beaver has some very small kits, and an otter is our largest carnivore. It's the only sort of big carnivore really we've got left. And we can see the beavers come back here after chasing that otter away. Job well done. And here's another clip of sort of wildlife meeting each other for the first time. Another potential predator of small beaver kits is the fox. And I guess you've got to remember that this footage is taken in the middle of the night when it is completely dark. So there's probably, these two animals have probably got no idea that they're bumping into each other. But we can see from that shot as well that beavers are fairly big and are asking some of the local predators to move out the way. Over the length of the 5-year trial, beavers built lots of dams. In fact, they built around 120 dams during the 5.5-year trial. Many of those beaver dams are ephemeral habitats, so they come and they go over time depending on local food resources. If there's a particularly tasty bit of food, say at this time of year, the beavers are very capable of building a new beaver dam, increasing the water height for a short amount of time so they can sit in the water and feed in safety. When those beaver dams break down, which they inevitably do, if beavers don't look after their dams, then you have new habitats and quite a dynamic situation in streams and rivers where previously it was fairly much the same for a long period of time. So as these beaver dams arrive, we see an increase in stream bed height, and we see some really nice riffle sections, which are sort of pebbly, fast-flowing areas downstream of beaver dams. When we take river restoration experts around the catchment, they get very excited to see this kind of, or these types of dynamic processes taking place. Obviously, if beavers are in streams and rivers, they will have an impact on the aquatic ecology that survive within those streams. A new PhD, again at X University, has recently started that will spend quite a bit of time picking the relationships between certain species apart and seeing how beavers impact on those species. Throughout the 5-year trial, we've had Southampton University involved in some electrofishing work where they put current through the water. The fish float up to the surface and you catch them in a net, and then you can identify the species and measure the size of that particular fish. And results of the electrofishing, they're quite interesting. And this is at a reach where we've got a big beaver dam covering one of the tributaries. And on the left-hand graph, we can see that they've surveyed 4 different locations downstream of beaver activity, at an old beaver dam site, which is now a nice gravelly riffle section, behind the main beaver dam in the beaver pool, and upstream. And we can see the most sort of biomass of fish is living within the beaver pool behind the main beaver dam. If we break down and look at a particular species, so the brown trout on the right-hand graph, we can see that the size of brown trout are different in different sections of the stream. Within the beaver pool, we've got large brown trout. Brown trout are territorial, so those big trout are getting the best habitat and are sitting there feeding on a range of aquatic invertebrates. And at the old dam site, you can see that the fork length of the brown trout are very small. So that old dam site that's created a new riffle section is supporting some juvenile brown trout. There's still a lot of work that needs to take place around fish migration and fish movement. And later on, I'll talk about how different people feel about the reintroduction of beavers. And a group of people that do feel concerned are people interested in fishing. Along the River Tail, which is the largest tributary of the River Otter, a number of landowners have reported seeing sea trout move up over beaver dams, which is really exciting to see. And last year, another PhD student, which I'll talk about later, called Roger Oster, managed to get footage of fairly large sea trout. We can just see one leaping out of the water here, making it up a beaver dam that's around 1.2 meters high. So in high winter flows or high autumn flows, when sea trout run upstream to create areas where they can lay their eggs within the stream bed, the beaver dams break down. They're not made of concrete, and the wood and the debris splits up a little bit in high flows, and channels are created. And this is what the sea trout use to jump up and over the top of these beaver dams. Beaver dams don't always turn up in areas that you may want a beaver dam. And beaver dams can grow very quickly. Once the water spills out over a stream or ditch, beavers will attempt to create a pond. And you can see in this photo, water's trickling into the floodplain from the left-hand side. And the beavers have created a shallow bund, effectively a small dam, around the side by dredging within that pond and piling material on top to form a small pond. The beavers will then sit in that pond to feed on some fairly nutritious agricultural grasses. If you do nothing about a beaver dam, they create new wetlands. And that small beaver dam in the last photo turned into this fairly large beaver pond within a couple of months. And you can see behind the overflow from this pond actually re-wetted quite a large section of agricultural grassland. At the time, the farm manager at this site was concerned, and I'll go on later to talk about how we can keep water in streams by managing the height of water behind beaver dams. What was evident though was the creation of biodiversity at this site. My colleague and I walked it. We saw snipe, lots of teal, little egrets, swans, geese, and we also saw evidence of predation on teal. So again, really exciting for ecologists and conservationists to see this kind of habitat created by beavers. What we hope to happen in the future is that agri-environment schemes reward landowners for this kind of thing. So if beavers move onto land, you can't just sacrifice land and take the cost yourself as a farmer. So what we really hope the government does, and they have a good opportunity to do this, we are leaving the Common Agricultural Policy as we rip ourselves away from Europe. And that gives us a chance to evaluate how we pay landowners and farmers and what we want to pay them to do. Obviously, food production is of paramount importance, but there are other things we desperately need farmers to produce for us. We need farmers to give us clean water. We need farmers to capture carbon, and we need farmers to create as much biodiversity as possible. And we're now going to talk about a case study where we can look in detail at the relationship between beavers, the creation of biodiversity, the benefits they provide society through creating more flood resilient landscapes, but the local impact that that has on agriculture. And this case study is looking at another tributary in the River Otter catchment, and that's a tributary that flows through a small village of East Budleigh. And over the last 20 years, East Budleigh has had around 5 flood events. Beavers at this particular location raised water levels by creating a set of 5 or 6 beaver dams within a fairly short stretch of the stream, and that blocked some drainage channels. As a result of the raised water table, the farmer could not get onto the land last spring to plant his organic crop of early potatoes. Now, it turns out that's quite an expensive crop. The farmer couldn't plant £600 worth of seed potatoes and missed out on around £1,500 worth of profit from the potatoes that he hasn't effectively planted. So approximately £2,000 worth of impact for this farmer at this location. Now, the flip side of that is that those beaver dams have reduced the amount of water moving through East Budleigh after significant rainfall events. Simply put, they're creating a more flood resilient landscape. They're holding water back at the top of the catchment and drip feeding it over a longer period of time into the stream. That's hugely beneficial for society, and that's potentially putting a big pound sign next to beavers. A really important point to make at this point is that those benefiting from the beaver reintroduction, the flood-prone community here at East Budleigh, aren't currently bearing the costs of having the beavers back in the landscape. That's a loop that government need to act to close to reward landowners and farmers for giving over land for public goods and public benefits. We're now going to look in more detail at how beavers impact on flow and water quality. And to do this, we can take ourselves out of the River Otter and move to West Devon, back into the enclosure, where we've had beavers since 2011. And beavers have created a network of 13 ponds, storing over 1 million litres of water. In old money, that's 230,000 gallons. So a huge amount of water being stored at the top of the catchment. At this site, Exeter University have monitored water flowing into the site. That's the blue line on the right-hand side of the graph. And they've monitored water leaving the site. That's the red line on the left. This particular graph represents a period in August of 2014 when we had some very significant rainfall events. And those rainfall events are coming down from the top of the graph in sort of like a blue bar chart. And it's obvious there that we have 3 significant rainfall events, and that means that the water coming into the site peaks very rapidly. That kind of response in a hydrograph is what causes flash floods. That's what causes tens of millions, probably hundreds of millions of pounds worth of damage across England, and causes a huge emotional damage for those people involved in floods around England. What's exciting in this graph is that on the left-hand side, we can see that the outflow to the site doesn't have that same dramatic peak. The beavers are storing water at the top of the catchment. They're slowing the flow of water and they're pushing water onto the floodplain. That's a huge benefit to society. As the water slows down, sediment drops out. And at this particular site, Exeter University had automated machines for taking water quality samples. And we can see a litre of water coming into the site is brown, it's full of sediment, phosphate, nitrates, and the water leaving the site is effectively clean. Sediment has dropped out of it, and science from Exeter University shows that environmental pollutants like phosphate and nitrate are captured in those beaver dams as well. That's really exciting if we want to think about the quality of drinking water and potentially reducing our drinking water sort of costs for cleaning water, but it's also hugely exciting if you're interested in aquatic invertebrates and the species that eat them in watercourses, because clean water is what we need in our catchments. As well as looking at the water quality, we're now going to move back into the River Otter. University have modelled how many dams they think the River Otter catchment could tolerate, or how many dams can squeeze into the catchment effectively. And the PhD student called Hugh Graham has modelled this looking at the physical characteristics of, or the topology of the River Otter catchment. Using that, the data from that model, which is called the Beaver Dam Capacity Model, we can then add another layer into that model, which gives us the potential costs of having beaver dams at any one location. So we could put into that model the cost of beaver dams on agriculture at a particular site, or the potential cost on fishing at a site or property. And all of those costs could be put into this model, and then we get a dam conflict model. And that's a fairly simple traffic light system where we see areas in red within this small catchment here in the River Otter, where we simply won't be able to tolerate beaver dams, and areas in green where there's significant opportunity for beaver dams or beavers to live and create beaver dams to deliver many benefits, such as creating biodiversity, storing water, cleaning water, that kind of thing. And as a beaver manager, that model is extremely helpful for me when I'm responding to new beaver dams. One of the main landowners we've worked with over this 5-year trial has been Clinton Devon Estates. And it's fair to say that without Clinton Devon Estates support, the trial probably wouldn't happen in the first place. They're a really big landowner at the bottom of the catchment, and they've supported the trial throughout its 5 years. I've worked very closely with one of their land managers, a chap called Ed, and in this particular slide, he's just nibbling the top of a beaver dam off with his tractor and grab. And he's doing that to effectively manage the impacts of beavers at this particular location. We've seen that beaver dams can create some real benefits, but if this beaver dam gets too high, a country lane just behind, 20 metres back, will start to get flooded. So there's some beaver management that needs to take place on Clinton Devon Estate land. We've used a device called a flow device. I think in America this is called a beaver deceiver. It's a bit too cheesy, I think, for us to use. But the flow devices effectively enable us as beaver managers to control the height of water behind beaver dams. It's a pipe that runs through a beaver dam or to one side, and the inflow to the pipe is protected by a metal cage. That means the beavers can't block the pipe or feel the flow of water, and that means that this pipe runs freely. And we can set the height of that pipe by changing the angle of the pipe to control the height of water behind the beaver dam. And at one location, we were able to change a beaver territory that was having a significant impact on agriculture back to an area that was as the farm manager wanted it, and at the same time maintaining the beaver territory and the beaver population. So that's a really good example of how you can tweak beaver dams so that they coexist in fairly intensively managed areas. Other impacts that beavers have is on trees. In the summer months, beavers feed on a range of soft vegetation growing in and around watercourses and also on bark, but in the winter months, their diet predominantly changes to that of feeding on bark. They're eating the cambium, the living tissue of trees. Many of our trees have evolved to coppice, and that's because over millions of years, they've evolved with large herbivores browsing on them. And that's no different to beavers. When we do our systematic survey every year of the River Otter catchment, we record what species beavers are feeding on, and we can see that most of the time the beavers are feeding on willow. But if you were to name a tree species in the River Otter catchment, I should imagine I'd confirm that beavers have had a taste of that tree. Beavers have evolved a semi-aquatic way of life, and as a result of that, they don't particularly like leaving water. Many of the feeding signs we see within the River Otter catchment are actually overhanging water. If the beavers move onto the bank, they typically move 1 to 2 meters to feed on small willow trees, and very rarely they move up to 40 meters away from a watercourse to feed on woody species. The furthest I've personally seen beavers move away from water is to feed on agricultural crops such as maize. Some of the work we've done has used some fairly snazzy modern technology. And hopefully this short video gives you an idea of that. Again, one of the PhD students working under Professor Richard Brazier at Exeter University uses a drone, and the drone lifts off up into the sky and flies a pre-programmed route across this particular beaver territory. And the drone takes endless photos, aerial photos. The PhD student then creates a 3D model by merging all of those images together. And that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at a 3D model made up of photographs taken from a drone. What Hugh Graham does then is that he analyzes the change over time of these 3D images of the county wildlife site. And from that, we can get a very, very accurate idea of the beaver impact on canopy structure at this particular county wildlife site. And as a result of beaver activity, more light is getting into aquatic habitats, which allows plants to grow and insects to thrive, and more light is reaching the terrestrial floor, so the land that's dry. Again, a really good thing if you want to maintain or increase botanical diversity. So the condition of this wildlife site has gone from red to amber, and that's specifically because the beavers are beginning to have an impact on willow scrub that's developed on this old water meadow. Sometimes beavers do feed on trees that people don't want them to feed on. Over the length of the trial, beavers have fed on hundreds of trees, and to date there have been 10 complaints by landowners about trees that beavers have chewed or felled. Quite often these are apple trees. The beavers come into orchards close to streams and rivers to feed on apples in autumn, and when the apples disappear, rather frustratingly for the landowners, the beavers can start to chew the trees. Over the 5-year trial, we've been in contact with beaver managers across the United States and Canada and across Europe, and we're using methods that are well proven, just demonstrating that they work in England. Here, my colleague Mark Elliott is painting a sandy paint mix onto a tree. This is a type of latex glue, and you mix it with any colour sand you want, and it dries to a fairly clear colour, but effectively you're putting a coat of sandpaper on the trunk of the tree, and beavers do not like feeding on trees covered in sand. If you really want to guarantee that beavers aren't going to feed on a tree, you'll probably need to wire it. And I guess that's no different than many people do across the country. I live close to Exmoor, and we have some fruit trees, and we've had to protect them from fairly large herds of red deer. But the beavers are a new species, so people are having to change their behaviour, and that's a big thing. And in this particular orchard, this was the homeowner's only Bramley apple tree, and that obviously isn't a great look for a Bramley apple tree. It is still surviving. This summer it has lots of apples, but obviously that's not helpful if you've got an orchard. Fencing orchards off, protecting individual trees, or electric fencing is what you need to use. As well as having impacts on trees, beavers do impact on agricultural crops. And in this photo, we can see a track into a maize field. And this is a brief video of one of the methods we use to control where beavers can go. Electric fencing is used to control movement of many stock animals, and it works really well for beavers. You can see the beavers come to no harm, but that beaver has been put off going into the maize field. Electric fencing is really easy to put up, and it works very, very well to stop beavers doing a range of different things. Of key importance with maize fields, it's not really the economic cost of losing crop to beavers, because that's tens of pounds. The beavers don't feed on very much. What, as a beaver manager, I'm more concerned of is the fact that if you have a large food resource close to a small stream, you have effectively a supermarket for the beavers, and the beavers will want to live close to that food resource. As a result of that, they may dam a small stream, potentially impacting on drainage of agricultural fields, and they may dig a lodge into the side of the bank. Forage harvester is a very expensive piece of kit, and if we had a forage harvest to go into a beaver lodge, that would be a costly mistake. So at this particular location, I put some bamboo canes up with some flags on top, and that tells the forage harvester driver to steer clear of the riverbank. Now, ideally, I would love farmers to get effectively rewarded for farming away from watercourses. I walk the catchment daily. I'm very fortunate to do that, but in the winter months, I do see some very shocking sights of soil runoff into our streams. And in an ideal world, farmers could step this kind of agricultural production further away from watercourses, which would in some way help us with beaver management, but would massively increase the health of our streams and watercourses. In 2019, we set up a separate group to the River Otter Beaver Trial, and that was to develop a management strategy for managing beavers if the government permitted that they could remain. We now know they are able to remain, and we will be lobbying government very hard to put in place a sensible beaver management strategy for beaver populations in England. And this document is a fairly straightforward document, but it took a lot of time and a lot of talking with groups including the National Farmers Union, CLA, Environment Agency, Game and Conservation Wildlife Trusts, that kind of thing, West Country Rivers Trust, a lot of conversations about how to manage beavers in the future. And we ended up with a fairly simple hierarchy of managing beavers. And it starts with education. So to work with landowners to make sure that they're aware of what beavers do and how to manage their impacts. It then moves on to actually stepping in or rewarding landowners for certain management or having beavers on their land. It asks for a resource to be made available for a beaver manager to help and support landowners that are getting used to having an old species back in the landscape. That kind of management includes the things I've been talking about. So maybe the installation of flow devices, managing the height of beaver dams, protecting agricultural crops and trees. Sometimes we will need to trap and remove individual or families of beavers. We wouldn't, for instance, want a family of beavers living in Honiton sewage works. Now, trapping and removing beavers is fantastic if you've got somewhere to put those beavers. If you have nowhere to release those beavers, then culling a wildlife species becomes a serious discussion point. We sincerely hope that that doesn't happen anytime soon. In an ideal world, the government will realise what beavers can deliver for society, and there will be many opportunities, hopefully, across England to release any problem beavers that we have within the River Otter catchment. Over the 5-year trial, we've also looked at the health of beavers. So I've mentioned at the start of the talk that beavers were healthy when they went into the river in 2015. And over the 5 years, we've had experts like Roisin Campbell-Palmer here on the right-hand side coming down to monitor the health of the beavers. And we do have, and we continue to have, a very healthy population of beavers. There's nothing of real note to say about diseases carried by the beavers, other than they are reproducing well, and the kit survival rate is high. So kids surviving into adulthood and reproducing, and that's really what we want to see. In this particular photo, we've got Ed from Clinton Devon Estates, who's sat on top of a Hessian bag with a small beaver in, and Roisin at the back end of the beaver, attempting to find out whether it's a male or a female. So the process of trapping and tagging beavers is quite stressful for the animals. We've kept it to an absolute minimum, but we've had to do it as part of the Natural England licence. We bait beaver traps with apples. Beavers cannot resist apples, so they come into the traps. Once we've caught a beaver, we then get it in a net and transfer it from the net into a Hessian sack. That's quite easy if the beaver's small. It's less easy if the beaver weighs 30 kilos, but we've managed it to date. Once we've weighed the beaver, sexed the beaver, put ear tags and a pit tag into the beaver, we then release the beaver back into the trapping location. We're going to now move back to the Exeter University research and look at the attitudes to beaver reintroduction. Roger Oster, a PhD student under Professor Richard Brazier, actually created this, this diagram where we can see all sorts of words associated with beaver reintroduction. Levels of support have been really high throughout the 5-year trial. In a survey in 2017 with nearly 3,000 respondees, around 80% of people thought reintroducing beavers was a great idea, and in 2019 even more people thought reintroducing beavers would be a positive thing. The two groups to talk about that don't support or that support beaver reintroduction less, approximately 50-50, are fisheries and aquaculture and farming and agriculture. And I've talked about concerns from both of those groups already. And to finish off the talk, I'm really going to sort of look to the future. So the government have made a decision that is amazingly exciting for conservationists and ecologists. They've agreed to allow beavers to stay in the River Otter catchment and to spread naturally. So in time, beavers are likely to turn up in neighbouring catchments as the number of territories grows in the River Otter and individual beavers begin to jump across the top of catchments at watersheds. What we really need the government to tell us as soon as possible is whether beavers are going to be legally protected or not. There are pros and cons of protecting species, and will resources be made available for the management of beavers as outlined in our strategy document, and will farmers be rewarded for ecosystem services that beavers can provide. There may well be a beaver consultation this winter and spring, and if there is, I'm sure Devon Wildlife Trust will be in contact with members to lobby for excellent beaver management in England in the future. I'd like to finish this talk by thanking anybody that supported the River Otter beaver trial. The 5-year trial was funded entirely by Devon Wildlife Trust. Money didn't come from government, so it's been our members, our key supporters that have donated to crowdfunders and other fundraising campaigns, and then to other organisations that have paid for specific pieces of research or for some of the PhD work that's taken place. And that's where I'm going to end the talk this evening, and we'll go back to Steve, who will be able to go through any questions if people have any.
Thank you, Jake. That was really good. And I should have said at the beginning, we had more than 300 people listening to your talk, so thanks very much. I'm now going to go through the questions that have come through while you've been speaking, and start off with a perennial favourite for anybody who's worked on the beaver trial over the last 5 years, and that's, where did the beavers come from? Okay,
so we don't exactly know where beavers came from originally. What I can say is that it wasn't Devon Wildlife Trust. 2 beavers appeared in 2008. In the past, or in other areas of England, beavers have escaped from enclosures. Beavers are fiercely territorial, and young kits left in enclosures can feel the need to get out. We don't know if that was the case in the River Otter catchment. What I can say is it's a pretty bad way to start a reintroduction. We know that the founding population was a male and a female. Genetically, that's not good. And that's why Natural England have given us a license to release an additional 5 unrelated animals, so that the genetic diversity in the reintroduction is good. So in time, those unrelated animals will breed with the very closely related main population.
Okay, thank you. I could tell that's something you've been asked before. So another question's come in, and what do you think are the necessary conditions for beavers and humans to coexist in the UK? And could it work in more densely populated counties, areas of Devon and beyond Devon's boundaries?
Yeah, so I'm extremely optimistic about the future for the coexistence of beavers and us as a society. I think what we do need to talk about is the amount of space given over to nature. In 2011, there was a white paper produced by Professor Lawton, and that talked about space for nature effectively. It talked about more, bigger, better, and joined up. And that's looking at habitats. And it's the kind of thing I learned 30 years ago at infant school. It was that we need bigger habitats. We need them to be connected. We need corridors for wildlife to move through. And beavers really drive that discussion about how much space we choose to give nature. At the moment, we have intensive agriculture within 1 metre of the top of a riverbank. That's simply not enough space for nature. It's not enough space for rivers to produce clean water. Over lockdown, we've seen, I drive through Tiverton regularly, and we've seen lots of kids and families playing in the River Exe. We need that water to be of really high quality. So the discussion between how much space you give nature and farming has to take place, and the beavers will really drive that discussion. As far as beavers living in urban environments, across Europe and North America, beavers do live very or intertwined in urban environments. You typically find that there's less food resource available for beavers in urban environments, and therefore that might not be the core part of a beaver territory. There are some interesting projects starting up in England, however, in enclosures where beavers are being released into moderately urban environments. And I'm sure Devon Wildlife Trust will be talking about that in the future.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I mean, I've been to Bavaria several times on holidays and seen beaver signs in quite substantial, you know, Tiverton-sized towns in southern Germany. So they're there. That's very interesting. Thank you. Okay, there's a few questions around the same topic, so I'll try and summarize that. And it basically is about people asking what happens to the sediments that are trapped in beaver dams. And the first part of that question is, are they harmful, and is other wider pollution harmful to beavers themselves? So let's start with that, Jake.
So what happens to sediment? If we imagine a world without humans, just with beavers, beaver dams would fill up with sediment over time. Ponds are ephemeral habitats. They change successionally from open water to ponds with lots of vegetation growing, and then sediment begins to build up and trees begin to grow, and you'll end up with either a fairly wet water meadow or a wet woodland that will gradually dry out over time. So the sediment load with humans and with intensive agriculture is obviously increased, and that's because we have agricultural runoff. It's a disappointing byproduct of producing food for all of us. University have demonstrated that above the West Devon enclosure of beavers, that permanent pasture, so that's grassland that's never ploughed, is losing 70 tonnes of soil per hectare per year. That is an entirely unsustainable way of managing landscapes. Saying that, beaver dams are really good at trapping that sediment and holding that effectively pollutant back from streams and watercourses. Phosphate and nitrate and other chemicals will build up in that area, but will typically be fairly locked into the sediment. When beavers eventually move on from a territory, that will in the end turn into a very productive piece of land, and it will be very fine soil without any stones in. And it might be in the future, maybe 100 years down the line, we might well be taking old beaver ponds back into agricultural production. Who knows where we might go in the future. As far as any chemicals impacting on the beavers, I'm afraid I'm not too sure how well understood that is, other than any animals that live for any length of time do pick up toxins in their bodies. So potentially some impact on beavers, but not that I can talk about, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you. It's another question you're probably familiar with, but in Scotland, beavers have been given legal protection, but at the same time, licenses have been granted to landowners to shoot beavers, to control them. And the question is asking, looking ahead, how can we in England prevent the same situation occurring here? What was the way forward you'd like to see for legislation protecting beavers, or not protecting them, and their management?
Okay, well, I'm not going to talk about protection of beavers. there are pros and cons with protecting species legally. I think that decision actually may already be made legally by Scotland protecting beavers, but I'm not too sure how things will pan out in England. Steve, can you just repeat the question there?
Yeah, well, I'd say, what's the model you would see for the management of beavers in Devon?
Yeah, so Scotland have had beavers on the River Tay for many years, and there are lots and lots of beavers in that catchment. Frustratingly, Scottish farmers have had very little support for managing the beavers, and therefore feelings on beavers across the landscape have become polarised. Many people in agriculture see them as a real problem, whereas conservationists up in Scotland see them as a real benefit. I think what we can do in England, different to what has happened in Scotland, is to step in at a very early time when we have a limited number of beavers in a limited number of catchments, and to provide help and support to landowners as and when they need it immediately, so that they know that they have help. I have worked with many landowners across the catchment, some extremely thrilled to have beavers back in their or on their land, and some less keen. In fact, some very angry that they have beavers back on their land. Devon Wildlife Trust have effectively paid me to step in to be that buffer between reintroducing beavers and the landowners, and I've been able to step in to manage impacts as and when it's necessary. And I think that's worked really well in giving landowners confidence that you can step in and manage beavers. And it's a really important message that Devon Wildlife Trust should be getting across, is that if we reintroduce beavers, we know that we have reintroduced beavers now, is that it's not like releasing the large blue butterfly. Beavers are ecosystem engineers, and they can do fantastic things in some areas, but in other areas you have to step in and manage them, and you must make resources available for that management.
Okay, we've got to 7 o'clock, so I'm going to ask you just a few more questions, if I may, Jake, and we'll do some specific beaver questions that are about beaver biology and so on, and habits, and then return to one overarching question. So perhaps we can deal with these fairly swiftly. Do beavers move their lodges once their kits appear? Do they stay in the same lodge throughout winter?
Different for different families. We know that some beaver families keep their kits in the same location. Other beaver families have been observed moving their kits from one site to another site, potentially to avoid predation, potentially to avoid summer floods. But it's different for different beaver territories. But yes, beavers can move kits from one lodge to the next.
And that word predation leads me on to the next question. What are the predators of beavers and their kits? Are there any in Devon?
In the past, we would have had many predators. Right now, we've got no predators for an adult beaver, I think it's safe to say. But beaver kits could be predated in the water by fish species like pike. Out of water, beaver kits could be fairly easy for otters, foxes, badgers, maybe buzzards, that type of animal to prey upon. So small beaver kits, yes, on the menu for some animals. Adult beavers, not so.
Okay. And someone specifically asked, have there been any problems or incidents occurring between beavers and dogs?
Yes, there have. There was an incident in the River Otter a couple of years back in the summer months when beavers have kits, and like many animals, beavers are protective of their young. A dog, a fairly large dog, was in the river, and the dog, from accounts of people that saw the incident, the dog almost stumbled over an adult beaver, and we know that adult beaver had 4 kits that year. The beaver bit the dog a number of times. The dog survived. It did have to go to the vets and have antibiotics. I think the owner was not particularly angry with the beavers, but understandably maybe frustrated at that situation. What is clear in that stretch of river is that the landowners are very clear that dogs should be kept under close control. We get regular photos in of dogs killing wildfowl on the River Otter. It's fairly distressing to see. So I would encourage dog owners next or near to watercourses, or in fact in any areas where you've got wildlife present, is to keep your dog under close control. And I think it's a lesson that we as society will again need to learn. We have an old species back in the equation now, and we don't know how it behaves. So it's up for us to educate people and make sure people are aware that dogs should be kept under close control if they're close to beavers.
Okay, thank you. Do beavers eat Himalayan balsam?
Yes, but not enough. So we've got lots of Himalayan balsam in the River Otter catchment. Yes, they feed on it, but yeah, they're not going to have an impact on Himalayan balsam, unfortunately.
I've seen them eating it, but as you say, not quickly enough. That's the shame. Yeah. And then also asking another question specific to this project, are there still opportunities to volunteer on the River Otter Beaver trial?
Yeah, there are opportunities to volunteer on the River Otter Beaver trial. As we begin to, I was going to say come out of lockdown, but I should imagine we'll be back in fairly soon. We, as Devon Wildlife Trust, obviously have to look after our volunteers, and having COVID around doesn't make that easy. Saying that, just before lockdown, I had began to establish little groups of volunteers in certain areas that were able to keep an eye out on beaver activity for me, especially on public land, on public footpaths. And that's from sort of Ottery St Mary south to Budley Salterton. And then in the future, we will need a team of volunteers to help me effectively manage beaver impacts. And that could be to help protect trees using sandy paint mixes or netting, or to help manage beaver dams. So in the short, yes, Steve, volunteers will be required for managing beavers, but we just have to wade through COVID before that starts to happen in earnest, I think.
I guess the other thing to say is to just keep an eye on the volunteering opportunities on the Devon Wildlife Trust website. So they'll be posted there when there's an opportunity arising. Okay, so I said there'll be one final overarching question, and several people have asked a version of this, and that is really what next for beavers, and how long will it be before the beavers in the River Otter begin to colonize other river catchments nearby?
So beavers have already colonised neighbouring catchments. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on what you think, that particular beaver made it into the River Colne. That was during a period when we had a licence from Natural England, and any beaver that escaped from our catchment, we had to trap and bring back into the River Otter. It was not the River Otter and the River Colne beaver trial, it was the River Otter beaver trial. So yes, beavers will make it across watersheds into new catchments. Trying to predict when that happens is challenging, although it's safe to say that I'm sure in the next few years, beavers will move. You can see sort of areas of wetland at the top of catchments where you can imagine routes between certain areas. So potentially, yes, beavers on the River Colne, potentially into the River Yardley that leads into the Axe. But yeah, trying to predict that is tricky. As far as where we go next, Devon Wildlife Trust in a really solid position to be part of a movement forward to help to manage beavers. And I sincerely hope that Devon Wildlife Trust is able to do that.
Okay, Jake, thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk, and just from the level of questions and the level of involvement we've had this evening, I can see that the talk and beavers as a whole have been a topic that really grabs people's attention. It just remains for me to say thank you for tuning in tonight. And if you've contributed to the Beaver Appeals, the Beaver Crowdfunder and so on that we've run in the past, then thank you very much. And thank you too for being a member of Devon Wildlife Trust if you're a member. If you're not, then why not? You can see we're an amazing organisation and we do fantastic work. I think very brave work like the River Otter Beaver Trial. It's certainly been the most fascinating project that I've ever worked on in my 17 years working for Devon Wildlife Trust. So please have a look at our website. If you like what we do, think about joining us, think about donating to Devon Wildlife Trust. And have a look also at the future events that are coming up. We're running several more of these seminars, and I think we will continue to do so while COVID is with us and beyond. So thank you, Jake. Thank you, all of you, and have a very good evening. Bye-bye.